US regulators have shut the Silicon Valley Bank, or SVB, and have taken control of its deposits. Now, this after we saw the biggest bank failure since the 2008 global financial crisis. We will now understand how the bank's closure is impacting startups globally and especially in India. But first, let's give you a quick roundup of what all happened that led to this condition for the Silicon Valley Bank. Well, the shares of the bank lost over 60% of their value in a matter of a couple of days. How did this happen? SVB's problems were sparked by customers withdrawing their funds. Now, after there were global recession fears, several customers, several depositors were demanding their funds back. That led the bank to sell its securities positions to be able to repay these deposits. That's how a bank usually functions, that whenever you deposit money in a bank, they put that money somewhere else in investments and they don't immediately have that much money to pay back. But whenever depositors ask for that money back, these banks have to arrange for that liquidity, have to arrange for that money. So when depositors were demanding their money back, SVB had to come up with new measures to ensure that liquidity. This is where the problem starts. The bank had to sell the securities that they had, the security positions that they had at significantly less rates than what they had bought them for. The prices had fallen because of a consistent rise in the interest rates by the United States Fed Reserve. Now, whenever these interest rates are hiked, securities lose their prices. So to pay depositors' requests, the Silicon Valley Bank was forced to sell off some of its investments at a time when their value had declined. Now, the bank said that it had lost nearly $2 billion as a consequence of this. Now, a question is, what is the fallout of this? What is the fallout of the SVB bank collapse? Several reports say that deposits of several Indian startups are stuck in the Silicon Valley Bank. The Y Combinator CEO says that thousands of startups globally are at risk. He also says that it is an extinction level event for several startups globally. The Y Combinator CEO also said that startups are set to face a 10-year setback along with the innovation and tech industry. There are also fears of a cash crunch in several Indian startups because several Indian startups have reportedly gotten investment from this bank and they've also deposited their money in this bank. Now, reports say that the Silicon Valley Bank has exposure to over 20 Indian startups and the Silicon Valley Bank invested in Indian firms such as Carvale, Bluestone, etc. They were also one of the first investors in Paytm, but Paytm clarified that they had sold their stake, SVB had sold their stake, and they're currently no longer a shareholder in Paytm. Now, to understand how this is really impacting the Indian startup space, we have a guest joining us on the broadcast, Ruchit Garg, who is from the Harvesting Farmer Network, another Indian startup. And Ruchit Garg, thanks very much for joining us on the broadcast. And let me first ask you, by setting the record straight, do you have any exposure to the bank, to the Silicon Valley Bank? Do you have any investments from the bank, or do you have any deposits stuck in that bank currently?
Yes, we do. Actually, we have been banking across several startups for over 10 years with Silicon Valley Bank. We have deposits in the bank, which is right now stuck, and wires are not getting out. Thankfully for us, situation is a little bit better because most of our operations right now is in India, and just by sheer planning and luck, we have a lot of money already made as an FDI to Indian entity we have. But there's still large portion of money sitting in SVB Bank in US right now.
So are you saying that there's no impact that you're currently seeing, at least in your company, but are you hearing of any cash crunch in any other startups?
No, so definitely, as far as HFN is concerned, there is no short-term and mid-term implication for us because we have planned it that way. But there are multiple startups who are stuck with the money, especially the ones who are operating outside from the US itself. Because if a startup is working out of India, I'm pretty sure they have a lot of funds in Indian banks as well. So this problem is mostly or magnified if you have one bank that is SVB and you are based out of Silicon Valley.
Right, of course, and in fact, 50% of US venture-backed tech and life sciences companies banked with the SVB, according to the Silicon Valley Bank's own website. So that impact will really be felt by the US tech startups. But if we talk about Indian startups, several reports say that 20, 30 and several Indian startups have exposure to the Silicon Valley Bank. You being an entrepreneur yourself, do you understand any such impact on Indian startups, if not your own firm, but in other firms that might have exposure? What all could the risks be for such firms who have exposure to the Silicon Valley Bank?
So I think for Indian startups, it would be minimal impact right away from the deposits. However, having said that, this SVB president is sort of shaking the market right now. I'm also hearing that FDIC right now is at First Republic Bank trying to figure out, how they don't get onto the SVB route. So it seems to be snowballing in some way. But for short term, if the startup in India have some deposits in US and some in India, they should be fine. The negative impact I could see is, the investment, which is already getting a little tight for startups all across the globe, may get further tighter. But short term, very short term, I don't think there's an issue for Indian startups who are operating out of India.
Right, and as you mentioned that if startups have deposits in India and abroad, then there could be minimal impact. But as you just touched upon the point about investments, there are several reports that say that several Indian startups such as Carvale, Bluestone have investments from the Silicon Valley Bank. In fact, Paytm also had investments, but now Silicon Valley Bank is no longer a shareholder because they completely diluted their stake. So when it comes to investments from a startup point of view, if a startup in India has a significant amount of investment from the Silicon Valley Bank. So for a common person, can you just explain how could this impact their day-to-day operations? As several reports say that startups might be feeling a cash crunch. They might be going to the extent of not being able to meet their daily expense requirements, even their payroll expectations.
Yeah, so Silicon Valley Bank does investment in two ways. One is equity-based investment and one is debt-based investment. So assuming it is an equity-based investment, there shouldn't be any issue SVB getting closed down because the money is in the startup's bank, let's say HDFC, ICICI or some other Indian bank, and SVB is closing down. It doesn't have necessarily a direct immediate impact on that startup. However, if SVB has given a venture debt, then most of the time that comes with a liner where it says that you have to keep the cash in SVB bank. So if a startup or a company has raised venture debt from SVB, and they are keeping that cash in that bank, SVB bank, then there might be some problem. Otherwise, if there is no problem, I could see for the startups who have received the money as an equity from Silicon Valley Bank.
Right. That's in fact very important to point out there the difference between the two. That if it's an equity investment, that means that the money might have already been received by these startups. So there's little risk there, little to no risk there because the money is already in the hands of the startups. But if it's a debt-back investment, then of course the money was still in the Silicon Valley Bank, and that's why that could still be stuck. So that's an important point that you point out. If we also now talk about the government's role here, the government has said that we will be meeting Indian startups. The Minister of State Rajiv Chandrasekhar tweeted out that we'll be assessing the impact, and this could be disrupting startups. The SVB bank collapse could be disrupting startups. So we're going to meet startup owners to find out what the impact really is. So what, as a startup owner yourself, from a startup yourself, what would you expect from the Indian government to do at this point?
I mean, frankly, I don't see any, value here. It's great that Rajiv Chandrasekhar is taking this step and meeting the PM and assessing the scenario. I don't think specific to this issue, government can do anything. If at all, I think government should focus on making the banking a lot more better, faster, cheaper, which government is already doing for Indian companies. But related to SVB, I think there is very little Indian government can do right now. One possible way out could be that, let's say there are tons of startups who have venture debt, who have money blocked in SVB bank. Maybe, government may, give out some, cheap loan to those startups. But I'm not contemplating anything big out of that meeting right now.
Right. And since you said that the impact on Indian startups could be minimal, so as we just get your wrapping comments on this, you must have also gone through those reports that say that several startups are struggling for their daily expenses. Several startups are struggling to meet their payroll requirements as well. So do you think there's some sort of panic that's being created in terms of the impact on Indian startups while the actual impact is not too much?
So actually, those 1,000 company number is mostly US centric companies.
Right.
And I know, unfortunately, if somebody doesn't buy the bank in next 24 hours, which is likely to happen, there may be mass layoff in Silicon Valley and the US tech companies. Again, Indian companies are a little bit shielded because if the operations are here, most of the money, I'm assuming, is here. At least they don't have a short-term crunch. But coming back to, the fear, yes, this is all hysterical. I mean, what it takes is somebody or government just say that, hey, we guarantee you the money, and everything itself will almost automatically figure it out. It's just the people getting scared that my money will get stuck, and it is snowballing everything else. So whether it is Elon Musk raising hand saying, hey, I'm buying SVB, or somebody else, that's what it needs. Somebody needs to say your money is safe, I'm buying it out, take a breath. That's pretty much it.
Right. So there's not that much to worry about as a lot of news reports might be citing, and there's a lot of fear and panic, of course, going around. Ruchit, Garg, thanks very much for joining us on the discussion and really clarifying all of those doubts and busting all of those myths that are going around in terms of the impact on Indian startups from the SVB bank collapse. Thanks very much for joining us again.